Coming up, hard choices for the U.S. government.
Really, what you have to do is you got to make a choice about what's your role in the world, what kind of weapons do you want to buy, where do you want to keep your deployments. Those are tough issues.
Center for American Progress Senior Fellow Lawrence Korb talks defense spending, health care for the military, and nuclear proliferation. It's just ahead on Global Ethics Forum.
I'm David SPEEDIE, Director of the Program in U.S. Global Engagement here at the Carnegie Council, and I'd like to welcome our viewers today to a very special interview with Dr. Larry Korb, the Senior Fellow at the Center for American Progress and a Senior Advisor to the Center for Defense Information, both in Washington. He served on active duty for 4 years as a Naval Flight Officer in the Naval Reserve and retired with the rank of Captain. He then served as an advisor to the Reagan-Bush Election Committee in 1980 and was appointed Assistant Secretary of Defense from 1981 to 85. He's the author of 20 books. He's made over 1,000 television appearances. And Larry, we're delighted to welcome you to the Council for what I hope will be a fairly free-ranging discussion on items of vital national interest. You've really developed a reputation, I would say a non-pareil reputation, and that is as someone who monitors and reports on defense budget issues. Recently, you commented on a remark by a Defense Department official, and I quote, "There is no easy way to identify savings in the defense budget. We will have a military that is smaller, less technologically advanced, and much less ready in the future." What were your reactions to that?
Well, basically, that was an article by Christine Fox, who headed the Office of, Cost Evaluation, really the person who decides where to spend the money in the Department of Defense. And she says, and I agree with her, there are no easy ways to cut the defense budget. Everybody says, oh my goodness, get rid of fraud, waste, and abuse. You got too many generals and admirals and your staffs are too big. Really, what you have to do is you got to make a choice about what's your role in the world, what kind of weapons do you want to buy, where do you want to keep your deployments. Those are tough issues. Now, she claims that with the amount under sequestration, the budget for 2013 will be about $475 billion, that would cause these problems that would make us worse than we have in the last 30 years. No, it won't. If you take a look at the amount of money, $475 billion, if I control for inflation, that's more than we spent on average in the Cold War when we had an existential threat, and it only takes us back to 2007. And this, in addition to our base budget, we have a separate budget for the war. So when you add that, we're spending close to $600 billion, which is pretty high, and if you go back, it's more than we were spending at the height of the wars in Vietnam and Korea.
Mm-hmm. So it's a matter of sensible choices.
Well, it's a matter of making tough choices. Now, what happened after 9/11, the country panicked and, we went into this crisis mode. The defense budget, the base one, nearly doubled. So they didn't have to make hard choices. They could have everything. And in addition to not making hard choices, they didn't manage the process very well. One of the things when I wrote a response to Ms. Fox's article, I pointed out something John McCain said. So our procurement system's a mess. Things are late, they're over budget, they come in, sometimes they don't even come at all. We spent $30 billion on weapons we didn't get anything for. So really what you need to do is get back and run it the way it has been in the past. If you take a look in the post-Vietnam drawdown, you had a great Secretary of Defense, MELVIN LAIRD, and he brought in David Packard from Hewlett-Packard to be his manager. Now, I'll tell you something that may surprise you. You know who was a very good Secretary of Defense? Dick Cheney. And because the White House brought in Don Atwood from General Motors, and they managed the post-Cold War drawdown. And again, if you put that in constant dollars, that got down to $375, so you're way above where you were after Korea, Vietnam, and the end of the Cold War.
And as I think you also pointed out in this article or elsewhere, we spend more than China, Russia, the UK, France, Japan, India, Saudi Arabia, Germany, Brazil, Italy, South Korea, Canada, and Australia combined.
Right, and a lot of them are our allies, So, yeah, I mean, I think when you see what happens is when we had the Budget Control Act in 2011, as the first part of it, all agencies and what we call the discretionary budget, not the entitlements like Medicare, Social Security, basically were told over 10 years to cut roughly $480 billion from your budget. but it was from your existing budget. The defense budget was still scheduled to go up for another 10 years. So they took that cut, and so the growth slowed. Then under sequestration, you took roughly another $500 billion, so that's a real cut. But basically people hear, oh my goodness, you're cutting the defense budget by $1 trillion. Well, yeah, but it's over 10 years, and the first half was from projected growth. And that's why when all is said and done, you're back to where you were in 2007, the last year of the Bush administration. I don't ever hear anybody saying, oh my goodness, you know, we don't have enough. And again, this is the base budget. The war budget's separate.
Yeah, interesting. You mentioned there in passing some of these list of countries or allies. How does this play out in terms of the quite substantial, if not draconian, budget cuts that are taking place, especially in Europe, the UK, France, other sort of allied countries? This has caused some strains and stresses within the NATO alliance, I know. The operational readiness, of course, when when the last Secretary of Defense left, he gave this warning to the Europeans, a pretty stark warning. How's that play out in our defense budget?
Well, you got two issues here. One is the Europeans become free riders. They say, well, you know, the United States is spending all this. They can take care of any threats. We don't have to, and we want to focus on other priorities. The other is, and I think this is something Europe is going to have to determine, what role do they want to play in the world? Because during the Cold War, it was us and the Europeans to prevent Soviet communist expansion. Now, what is the threat to Europe? How do they see themselves? I applaud the French for what they did in Mali. And they're going to have to decide, do they want to do that? They've got ties to a lot of these countries where you're having problems and you're having sort of offshoots of al-Qaeda take place. And if they want to do it, they're going to have to spend more and be more ready.
Yeah. Is NATO obsolete?
Well, I think, you know, if NATO didn't exist, we wouldn't invent it. But it's there.
You wouldn't invent it.
No, I mean, basically it was there during the Cold War and served a useful purpose. It achieved its objective. The question became, well, what now? It doesn't hurt anything because you get the countries together and they talk, and it provides a forum. But I argued when the Cold War ended almost 20 years ago, don't expand NATO, because it would send the wrong signal to Russia, which of course we did.
Many of us did,
and, you know, now of course you have Putin saying, see, they're trying to surround us. They want to, you know, President Bush, George W. Bush, was talking about bringing Georgia into NATO. My goodness, I mean, that would really, or Ukraine.
And Ukraine, yeah, exactly, yeah. And final thought on the domestic debate over the budget. I remember back in the days of the Gingrich Revolution, I remember there was this fascinating sort of pitting of the budget hawks against the Pentagon hawks. And these were often bedfellows. I mean, out there on the sort of the more conservative wing of the political spectrum. But there was this tension between those who were adamant about cutting the budget but those who said everything but the Pentagon. Is that a fair recollection?
Well, yeah, it was, because
today?
most of the people, and they wanted to cut things like welfare spending. I mean, that was what they were pushing for. And the Republican Party back then basically said, well, government doesn't do much except for defense, so we got to provide for that. But it's changed, completely different now. When we came up with sequestration, you know, we said, okay, you got a year, you put this super committee, this committee together to come up with $1 trillion in cuts or tax increases. Everybody figured that the Republicans would never let sequestration hit the Pentagon because they like it. But this is a different Republican Party. It's going back in many ways to the Republican Party of Robert Taft. You know, I mean, who didn't want to...
Never mind Gingrich, back to Taft.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, I mean, Newt Gingrich is still pretty much a defense hawk, but you get people like Rand Paul, for example. They don't want to see America play in the world. Mike Kaufman from Colorado, a former Marine, he said, well, you know, what do we want to save the world? Let's focus here at home. So what happened is they didn't care about sequestration hitting the Pentagon, and so that's why we have it for both the Pentagon and the other agencies who have an annual discretionary budget.
Yeah. And a final thought on this, where two sort of aspects of debate, the current debate, really come into play, and that is the Pentagon, the budget, and the healthcare issue. I read recently some amazing statistics about the percentage of the Pentagon budget that will eventually have to go to healthcare of survivors and their families. And in fact, someone I think once said something about it's going to become a healthcare provider with defense on the side. obviously a bit of an exaggeration, but do you know much?
Yeah, oh yeah. In fact, Admiral Mullen, when he was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and Secretary Gates said healthcare costs are eating us alive. Because here's what happened. Basically, back in 1995, they told military retirees, if you don't want to get the care we promised you at the base, you don't live near one or whatever, we're going to set up a program called TRICARE. It's kind of like a PPO that, you know, a lot of us have in our civilian jobs. And because of your service, you're going to pay less than other folks. So we're going to charge you $430 a year for this coverage for a family, okay? But it's going to go up each year to reflect the growth in healthcare costs. They didn't raise it until 2013. And so what happened was, at the first thing, the government would pick up 75% of the cost. Then it's down to 8% now. And what happened with two things. One, the government has to spend more and more, and these are for working age retirees. Remember, you can retire from the military, you know, at 40 years old. Less and less of them took the health care where they worked. They stayed on this because it was so much, you know, less expensive. And so when you talk, as I have, hey, you have to do something. People think, oh my goodness, you're going to, you know, the people who've been impacted and wounded in Iraq or Afghanistan. No, that's the VA. It's a separate budget. It has nothing to do with this. These are healthy, working age retirees. I mean, when we did our study about it, we found out that a retired admiral whose pension very close to $200K, who was elected to Congress, pays almost $200, stayed on TRICARE. Okay, because it was so much less expensive. You know, we found out retired colonels working for Booz Allen Hamilton making, you know, 6 figures, stayed on TRICARE. So you need to do that. The next thing is that up until 2001, a military person who retired in the military after 20 years of service, when they turned 65, they go into Medicare like the rest of us, and they pick A, B, C, D, and, you know, make the thing. Well, a lot of people said, well, Medicare, sometimes you have to pay something, so we want a new program. So they came up with this idea called TRICARE for Life, in which basically you enroll in Medicare, but everything else is covered. No copays, no deductibles. Well, get older, you use a lot more. There was no money put aside for that. Came in, and that program, they don't charge anything for. So that's another reason that has, you know, that has gone up. So these are people like some of our automobile companies where you're paying for people who aren't there anymore, and it's taking more and more of your budget. You also, when you get into compensation, General Odierno, Chief of Staff of the Army, said, 10 years, I'm going to be spending all my money on people not there and people who are here. Because what happened was we have a standard that you give people a raise each year. It's called the Employment Cost Index. And it looks at what people in the comparable education and background in the private sector get. Well, when the war started, we kind of had a guilt complex, so we kept raising and raising more. It's 20% over where it should be. You know what the unfunded liability of the military pension system is? $1 trillion. So you have all of these things, you know, coming together, and you talk about the third rail of politics. You mentioned it, you know, my goodness, you know, people will say, you know, you don't appreciate what the men and women are doing. And no, the VA takes care of them, and you get, you know, policemen and firemen also risk their lives, which you have a standard that you pay them.
Let's shift gears for a moment, if I may, to Iran. President Rouhani has spoken both at the UN General Assembly, and he seems to be conveying the message that he is his own person and he has a mandate to do what he can in a very accelerated period on the nuclear issue. You've written though that Iran that it's not really so much of a question of whether he's a moderate and how the moderates are doing in Iran. After all, we had Khatami a few years ago, and that looked promising until the famous Axis of Evil speech and that kind of scuppered prospects there. But, you know, as you said, it's more a question of the U.S. willingness to negotiate and where we will go from here. Both presidents at the UN struck a measure of conciliatory and then harder line stuff, essentially speaking, I think, to the folks back home in both places. What do you think Obama can achieve at this point?
Well, I think he has the same opportunity with President Rouhani of Iran that Ronald Reagan, who I had the privilege of working for, with Gorbachev. You know, when Reagan started negotiating with Gorbachev, a lot of right-wing Republicans called him Neville Chamberlain and said, well, he's going to be succeeded by a Stalinist. This is, you know, just all a ruse and everything like that. And I think, you know, Obama has this opportunity, and he's got a great Secretary of State. You know, this is it for President Obama and John Kerry. John Kerry was born, in my view, to be Secretary of State, as we saw in the 2004 campaign, not a great politician. But he wants to make a mark on history, and I think we have to take this opportunity. And you have a chance, I think, not only to deal with the nuclear question, but the Syria question, because Iran is also involved there. And I think when Assad used the chemical weapons, that did not go over well in Iran because Saddam used them against them. So, I mean, I think you have a lot of things coming together. When you deal with international politics, need to remember Sir Harold Nicholson, you know, the British friend who negotiated at the Versailles Conference. Nations don't have permanent friends or enemies, they have permanent interests.
Let's mention Syria for a minute. You've said that attacking Syria would be a war of choice, not necessity. And you pointed to 3 historical precedents, beginning with Vietnam. What constitutes a war of choice, not necessity? And how do we avoid it?
Well, I think a war, if you have a war of necessity, like World War II, I mean, we were attacked at Pearl Harbor, Hitler declared war on us, you had to fight to the finish. I mean, there was just no way. A war of choice is you take a look at the situation and you say, we would like to influence the outcome using military force if we have to, because there are certain benefits to us and the international community. But then you got to look at the cost of doing it. You know, would Vietnam have been better off not coming under the control of Ho Chi Minh and the communists? You know, probably. But if you had told Americans you were going to lose 60,000 lives, you know, dead, you're going to spend, you know, in today's dollars, you know, close to $1 trillion, people would have said it's just not worth it. And I think that's the same way with Iraq. Is it good that Saddam is gone? Sure, but at what cost to us and to the people there, you know? And one of the things about international politics, you can't solve every problem. You got to live with some. Now, because we're so powerful, you know, people think we can and should. No, we can't. And I think the American people spoke up through their representatives on Syria. Hey, wait a second. You know, you really want to get involved in this? And, you know, you know, the other thing you've got to keep in mind, the Powell doctrine, you know. If you're willing to do it, you better be willing to go all in. And if you're not, you know, don't do it. Because, and I keep hearing people say, no boots on the ground. Well, basically, that means you're not willing to go all in.
Yeah, but you've also mentioned what you saw as limited successful interventions in Bosnia and in Kosovo, where, as you put it, the strategy was to force parties to come to the negotiating table. And then you contrast that with Iraq and Afghanistan, where the use of force without, as I think you said, a clear vision as to what any kind of negotiated settlement might look like. So you believe there is a time and a place for...
Well, yeah, I think so. And to the point I was trying to make in that article, okay, you look at the cost, okay, and you look at, you know, Kosovo, 78 days of bombing, no American lives were lost. Same way when in Bosnia, no American lives were lost. Or Libya, you spent $1 trillion. Now, got rid of Gaddafi. If that now was your thing to stabilize Libya, well, that was a different objective. But if your objective was, and so you have to ask yourself, are you willing, you know, in other words, is that an acceptable cost? And I think in the Balkans, it was. And basically, if you know, as you need to balance those. Now, are you always going to get it perfect? No. But I think you need to do that before you go in. And one of the things Colin Powell has quoted, the Pottery Barn rule, you know, where he says, you break it, you own it. So you go in and you overthrow Saddam Hussein, you got the country. So you got to ask yourself, you get rid of Assad, what are you going to do then?
Yeah, but on that, back to your point about it's not just a case of cost to us, but to the recipient country, so to speak. I mean, Kosovo is not exactly the model democratic polity at this point, especially in the north. There's still severe tensions. Iraq is a basket case. Coming back to your point about the cost to the people in the affected country, it may be a limited intervention with no cost to us, but...
The point I was trying to make in that article is you can limit it if you want to, and I think that's key. In Vietnam, we didn't. We kept doubling down the same way in Iraq and Afghanistan. You know, I've been very critical of some of the things President George W. Bush did, but I thought in the beginning in Afghanistan he was right. He told the Taliban, you know, get rid of al-Qaeda. We don't want to overthrow you, you know, stop. And they said no. So we went in and got rid of them. Then the next thing you know, we're trying to remake Afghan society. Wow, that's a different type of thing. And ask the British and the Russians what happens when you try and, you know, you do that. And I think that's where you have, if you're going to make it limited, you can. You need to be aware that you may not achieve your objectives if you keep it limited, but we have, and that's what I try to point out in that article, certain cases where we did.
Larry, we've got to the point with Russia under New START where we're prepared to make significant cuts in the nuclear arsenals on both sides. Is there any reason that we cannot go significantly below those levels under New START?
Well, you know, it's an interesting thing. You may have a confluence of a couple of events going back to the budget. If the United States wants to maintain the number under New START, which I think is, you know, 1,550 operational nuclear weapons, it's going to have to spend a lot of money right now because it's going to have to buy a whole new generation of ballistic missile submarines, at least $5-6 billion for each one. They have to buy a new generation of bombers and, you know, fix up the land-based missiles. They're going to have to modernize or make sure its existing, you know, weapons are up to speed and safe. You're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars. The Navy is saying, wait a second, if we want to build, quote-unquote, regular ships, we can't pay for these ballistic missiles. That should be a national, you know, program. So you might have people saying, well, you know, do we really need all of these? And I think that, you know, the president I know is doing a nuclear review. He could easily go right down to 1,000 right now and say, I'm going to go to 1,000. And if the Russians, if you want to come, fine. I think they would. They don't want to spend the money. They don't want to spend the money either. And that's more, you know, more than enough. And it would also enhance our reputation in the world. We tell Iran, don't you get nuclear weapons. Well, you know, you're now as a model, you know, you're saying, hey, we're going to, you know, we're going to get that. And people forget under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the existing powers were supposed to continue to cut theirs if you didn't want other people, you know,
Yeah, there's two parts to that. Treaty,
yeah, that's
absolutely.
right.
Yeah.
So, no, I think so. I think it would make a great deal of sense. And, you know, I think as we call them, the four musketeers here, you know, Gorbachev and Nunn and Perry and Kissinger are saying, you know, that you really can, you know, move in that direction. So I'd like to see us unilaterally just say, look, let's go to 1,000. We don't have to spend so much money right now. We could spend more, you know, on dealing with the troops and their health care or the pay or anything.
All the things we talked about. On that, I keep coming back, and I don't remember who it was. You may remember, but a general in the Cold War, I think, said, all I know is that their 50th weapon is going to mean a hell of a lot more than our 5,000th. In other words, after 50, the damage that can be done by 50.
Oh yeah.
What is 5,000? 1,000?
I know. I mean, it's way overkill. And if you go back and you look, I mean, the triad, nobody sat down and said, let's have three legs. The Navy was up. You know, under Eisenhower was massive retaliation. They weren't getting their share of the budget. The Air Force was getting it all because he was big on nukes. So they decided they get into the nuke business. See, and you know, and then of course, I mean, McNamara was the first one to say, wait a second. I mean, where do we stop? It was just, well, we'll just keep going and see how many we can get and all that. And he did, you know, put a limit on it and say, well, how many do you need to, you know, to accomplish your objectives? And you know, one of the things that Congress can't even see the plan that they have for the targets they would attack. And I think, you know, I remember talking to Senator Bob Kerry, you know, asking for that. They can't see it. How are they going to make their decision? Give us the targets. Stan Turner told me this story, Admiral Turner, who went on to become head of CIA, and I worked for him at the Navy War College. He said when he was in the Second Fleet, a couple of pilots came in that, you know, had a nuclear mission. He said, well, tell me what it is. They said, no, we can't tell you. He said, you tell me, I'm in charge. And they were going to drop like 2 nuclear weapons on some bridge in Bulgaria. I mean, you know, in other words, when you decide how many do you need.
You've written about the need for more of American soft power, which, you know, Joe and I at Harvard, of course, kind of coined the term. In conjunction with that, if Secretary Hagel was to call you into his office tomorrow and say, Larry, you're a former serving officer in the military, you've been thinking about these things as an academic and a think tank practitioner and scholar for 40-odd years. On the one hand, I get these cries about American exception, that we're still the exceptional nation, the world still looks to us. On the other hand, we can't be, as you said a few minutes ago, the world's sort of policeman, and the American public are crying against that. How do I balance this? What do I advise the president from the Pentagon's point of view?
Well, I think there are two things that you want to do. One is you want to say, if you want to use military force, make sure you're clear what your objectives are and how you know it's going to end. You know, how will this end? The other is, as you decide where to spend your money, think of how you might use it. Former Secretary of Defense Gates gave a speech at West Point, and he said any Secretary of Defense who recommends to the president to send large land armies into the Muslim world should have his head examined, okay? Well, if you're not going to do that anymore, then maybe you ought to spend less on the Army, more on special forces, more on drones, the type of weapons that you might use, or ships. And I mean, I think those are the things that you need to say, because no matter how much money you spend on defense, you can't buy perfect security. You always got to balance or take risks.
Larry, it's been a great pleasure. We've
Thank you,
covered a lot of
David.
territory, and thanks for your wisdom and insight.
Well, thank you for having me.
For more on this program and other Carnegie Ethics Studio productions, visit carnegiecouncil.org. There you can find video highlights, transcripts, audio recordings, and other multimedia resources on global ethics. This program is made possible by the Carnegie Ethics Studio and viewers like you.